Hey everyone, it's Mr. Graham here, and in this unit we've been talking about argumentative writing. We've got a quote here. It says, "The purpose of argument should not be victory, but progress." Now, we have arguments in society, and ideally we want them to be productive and foster critical thinking and the exploration of new ideas. But other times, they're not so productive, and they end up looking a little bit like this. So one thing I thought would be helpful for us to look at is what are some examples of bad arguments? And we're going to do that by taking a look at logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are common errors in reasoning that will undermine the logic of your argument. Fallacies can be either illegitimate arguments or irrelevant points and are often identified because they lack evidence that supports their claim. Now, logical fallacies are pretty popular and we see them quite often, but usually they are just misleading and harmful and don't really do anything to advance the discourse. So let's take a look at a few key logical fallacies. First one is the straw man fallacy. This move oversimplifies an opponent's viewpoint and then attacks that hollow argument. So let's take a look at an example. A doctor says we need to regulate candy so that consumers always have nutritional information on the candy wrappers and know what they're getting. Reasonable enough argument. The straw man argument is going to substitute that argument with a weaker one, a weaker version of their argument. So they might say, these doctors want to ban candy. Doctor never said that at any point, right? Banning candy is a terrible idea. We need to have some kind of treat on Halloween for our children. So you could have an argument that looks like this, super strong, right? It's got all this evidence, it's got all these details, examples, and since they can't argue against that maybe because maybe they don't have evidence and examples for their position, they are then going to resort to substituting your argument with a weaker straw man argument. And they're going to proceed to attack that argument, that misrepresented version of your argument instead. Next one is the either or fallacy. This is a conclusion that oversimplifies the argument by reducing it to only two sides or choices. They might say you can either eat broccoli every day or you can give up on being healthy entirely. Now we know that there are options in between that. You could maybe pick up exercise, or you could choose some other dieting options instead of eating broccoli every day. It doesn't have to be just those two. Maybe someone says either you support everything our country does 100% or you are against our country. Doesn't have to be that way. Maybe you support some of the policies and disagree with others, and there's more complexity and more nuance. Don't let someone make you choose between Charizard and Squirtle when Bulbasaur is also an option. Next up is the slippery slope fallacy. This is a conclusion based on the premise that if A happens, then eventually through a series of small steps through B, C, X, Y, and Z, those will happen too, basically equating A and Z. So if we don't want Z to occur, A must not be allowed to occur either. Here's an example. We can't allow teenagers to have cell phones. If we do, they will all become addicted to technology. The next thing you know, they'll stop talking to other human beings altogether. If they stop talking to other human beings, they won't be able to function in society. If too many people can't function in society, then we won't have a society. Therefore, we can't allow teenagers to have cell phones. So we went from claim A, we can't allow teenagers to have cell phones, to this slippery slope that says this will result in the collapse of society. And slippery slopes are, as misleading and harmful as they are, they're pretty effective in convincing people because they often operate on fear and saying, hey, if you allow this to happen, then boom, 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 all these other things are going to take place as well. Next up is ad populum, the bandwagon appeal. This says an appeal that presents what most people or a group of people think in order to persuade one to think the same way. Getting on the bandwagon is one such instance of an ad populum appeal. Advertisements do this a lot, right? Everyone else has this latest phone, therefore you need to buy one too. Of course, just because everyone thinks that way or everyone else is doing this doesn't mean you need to participate as well, but that's how the bandwagon appeal operates. And this can, of course, be used to really terrible effect. So we think about, Nazi Germany and propaganda and mass rallies that were being put out to convince people to all think in this same way and to take up this ideology, destroying and eliminating anything that opposed that ideology. Next up is ad hominem, against the person. This is an attack on the character of a person rather than his or her opinions or arguments. Let's say a dentist says, our children should be careful about eating so much candy because candy consumption has been linked to cavities. Now, instead of actually addressing the dentist's argument that maybe candy consumption has been linked to cavities, the ad hominem user is going to say only loser dentists and nerds believe stuff like that. All they've accomplished in their argument is they've insulted the dentist and disrespected them, but they haven't actually addressed what the actual argument is that candy consumption has been linked to cavities. Next up is whataboutism. This is charging your accuser with whatever it is you've just been accused of or deflecting in some way, rather than actually refuting the truth of the accusation made against you. We see this all the time, I think, sometimes with parents and their kids, right? Maybe a parent says, hey, you didn't brush your teeth. You need to brush your teeth every night. Child says, what about you? You don't always brush your teeth either. Sometimes in class, we see this as well. A teacher says, you're not supposed to have your phone out. Put it away. Student says, what about Bob? He has his phone out too, right? And, it's distracting, right? It's a way to deflect. It's a way to get the attention off of the misdeed of whoever is being accused, right? Just because Bob may be on his phone as well doesn't excuse the student in this case for being on their phone. They're just trying to deflect and avoid any kind of criticism here in this case. And whataboutism really, I believe this term was coined during the Cold War. So, the Soviet Union was oftentimes being condemned for these human rights violations. And what they would often come back with was they would say, well, what about these human rights violations that you've committed in your country as well? Kind of deflect and say, you're just as guilty. And so kind of putting that blame elsewhere and deflecting. Next up is gaslighting. Psychologists use the term gaslighting to refer to a specific type of manipulation where the manipulator is trying to get someone else or a group of people to question their own reality, memory, or perceptions. And this is where we see things like maybe someone says, what, you're crazy. I never said anything like that. When maybe it's very clear that they did. Or you're so sensitive, you're making a big deal out of nothing. And trying to totally reject what we know and the truth and everything like that. So to a point where you start to question your own reality and what has actually taken place. And instead saying, oh, no, you're crazy. I can't believe you're actually thinking these things. Next up, false cause. This is a conclusion that assumes that if A occurred after B, then B must have caused A. So I've got some charts that kind of illustrate this here in just a moment, but here's an example. When I wore my favorite t-shirt, OSU won their basketball game. If I wear that shirt on game night, it will cause OSU to win more games. Now, there's a pretty strong chance that this is just a matter of correlation. You wore your t-shirt that night and OSU happened to win their game. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because these things lined up doesn't mean that wearing the t-shirt causes OSU to win their basketball games. So it's really important that we make a distinction between correlation, when things kind of happen at the same time, and causation. Is there actually a cause there? Take a look at this chart here. It says divorce rate in Maine correlates with per capita consumption of margarine. And if you look at this, they seem to follow along the same path. Now, do these things have a causal relationship? Probably not. It may just be a coincidence that they happen to correlate with one another. Another chart here. Number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. And again, you look at this chart and you might think, oh, wow, these have a causal relationship. These seem to go along with each other. It seems like maybe the drownings are causing Nicolas Cage films or vice versa. And that's probably not the case. It just happens to be a weird coincidental correlation. Another one here, similar idea. Per capita cheese consumption, number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. And weirdly enough, they follow along and seem to have this correlation. So those are a look at our logical fallacies. It's important that you be able to identify these in arguments and to avoid using these yourself so that we can stop having arguments like this and have a productive, healthy discourse. Thanks for watching.